The stars were shining above like diamonds in a black ocean, and the ship moved slowly through the silent darkness of space, and the human named John sat inside with tired eyes and an empty heart, and he looked at the blinking lights on his screen and knew something was wrong with the engine, and he had no choice but to land somewhere soon, or he would be lost forever. He checked the map and saw a green planet nearby, and it had no name and no warnings and no signals, and he thought maybe it was safe and maybe he could fix his ship and leave quickly, and he pressed a few buttons, and the ship changed its path and entered the strange planet's atmosphere. The sky turned green and the clouds sparkled like crystals, and the land below was full of glowing plants and tall trees with leaves that moved like they were alive. And John landed in a soft valley near a river that flowed with blue water and steam that smelled like flowers and magic, and he stepped out of his ship and took a deep breath and felt calm for the first time in weeks. As he walked toward the river, he saw someone lying near a tree, and it was not human and not a machine, and it was a woman with silver hair and golden eyes and strange markings on her arms and legs, and she was breathing hard and looked like she was in pain, and John ran to her and asked if she was okay, but she did not answer and only looked at him with wide, tired eyes. John knelt beside her and touched her shoulder, and her skin was warm like sunlight, and her body was shaking like she was burning inside, and he thought maybe she was sick or hurt, and he remembered how he used to help his team relax back on Earth with simple massage, and he asked softly if she wanted help, and she slowly nodded her head and whispered something he could not understand, but it felt like yes. He placed his hands gently on her back and began to press and move his fingers in circles, and he felt her body slowly stop shaking, and her breathing became softer, and her eyes closed like she was falling into peace. And as he worked his hands along her shoulders and spine, he felt something strange like a pulse moving under her skin, like energy or light trying to come out suddenly. Her body began to glow with a soft white light, and her silver hair floated like it was underwater, and her skin shined like morning sun, and the air around them became warm and sweet, and the plants nearby started to open their flowers, and small, glowing insects flew in circles around them like stars dancing, and John pulled back in surprise and looked around with confusion and fear. Then he heard voices coming from the trees, and tall figures stepped out wearing long robes and carrying staffs made of crystal and gold, and their eyes were wide and full of shock, and they dropped to their knees the moment they saw the glowing woman and the human beside her, and they began to speak in a language John could not understand, but the words sounded like prayers and songs. One of them came close and bowed low and touched the ground and spoke in broken English and said, "The goddess has awakened, and the prophecy is true, and the seed bringer has come." And John blinked and tried to explain that he was just helping, and he was no god and no bringer of anything, and he just gave a massage. But they did not listen and kept chanting his name again and again like it was holy. The woman opened her eyes and smiled, and her hand touched John's, and she whispered in clear English, "Thank you, chosen one," and John felt a wave of energy move through his hand like warmth and peace and power all at once, and the others cheered and raised their arms to the sky, and the glowing insects flew higher, and the trees began to hum with soft sounds like music from another world. John stood there frozen and lost and full of questions and wonder and something else he could not name, and he looked at the woman and then at the aliens and then at the sky, and he knew that his life had changed, and this planet was not just a stop for repairs, but something more, and he was now part of something big and ancient and full of mystery. Valley echoed with songs and light, and the wind carried his name to every corner of the land, and the stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter, as if watching the beginning of a story that would change everything forever. John opened his eyes slowly and found himself lying on a soft bed made of glowing silk, and the walls around him were smooth and shining with a soft golden light, and strange symbols floated in the air like whispers made visible, and the air smelled like warm honey mixed with fresh rain, and for a moment he thought he was dreaming. But the memories of what happened near the river returned quickly like waves crashing inside his mind. Sat up and looked around and saw tall figures dressed in golden robes standing silently in a circle around him with heads bowed and hands folded and their faces calm like they were standing before a king or maybe a god. And John felt a chill in his spine, and he tried to speak, but his voice felt small inside. The giant room that hummed like it was alive, a door opened without a sound. And the woman from the river walked in slowly, her silver hair flowing behind her like a waterfall of light, and her golden eyes glowing gently, and she moved with grace. Like each step was part of a song only she could hear, and the others all knelt. As she entered and whispered a word in unison that sounded like Resh, came to John and placed her hand on his chest and smiled with warmth that melted the fear in his heart, and spoke softly in perfect English, saying, "You are safe now, chosen one. You are in the temple of the awakening, where the true are honored and the light of the past returns." And John blinked and said, "I am just a mechanic, I only helped you. I do not understand what has happened." And Jalea sat beside him and looked into his eyes and said, "For many generations our people could not bring life into the world, and the future was growing dark and cold, and the old songs spoke of a hand from the stars who would awaken the seed of life. And when you touched me, something ancient returned, and I felt it in every part of me, and the land felt it too. And now the priests believe you are the one from this prophecy." John shook his head and said, "I did not mean to do anything special. I saw you in pain, and I just did what I could." And Eliara smiled again and said, "Sometimes the greatest gifts are given without knowing, and your touch brought warmth where there was none. And now the people believe again, and they want to see you and understand you and honor you." Before John could reply, the golden doors opened again, and a group of alien children ran into the room laughing and glowing with energy, and they threw flower petals into the air and danced around John, singing a song in a language he could not follow. But it felt joyful and pure, and then one of them placed a small crown made of silver leaves on his head and said in broken English, "Thank you, healer of the land." John felt overwhelmed and stood up slowly and walked to the edge of the room where a balcony opened to a giant city carved into mountains and full of light and life, and he saw rivers glowing blue and bridges made of crystal and creatures flying in the sky like dragons made of feathers, and he felt like he had stepped into a dream painted by stars. Behind him, Eliara said, "The Grand Council wishes to see you. They want to understand your heart and your purpose." And John asked, "Are they going to test me?" And she nodded and said, "They believe only the true seed bringer can pass through the chamber of memory, where the spirit of the land will reveal your path and your truth. And if you are not the one, then the chamber will remain silent and cold." John took a deep breath and said, "I do not know if I am ready." And she said, "You are already walking the path, even if your feet do not know the way." And the people believe, and sometimes belief is stronger than knowledge and stronger than fear and stronger than doubt. Later that day, John was brought to the grand hall where 12 elders waited, each one with a crystal orb floating above their heads and their eyes shining with different colors like fire and water and wind and stone. And they spoke one after another, saying words that welcomed him and honored him. And then the floor opened slowly, revealing a staircase made of light that led deep underground. John walked down with Eliara beside him, and they came to a large door made of stone and vine. And Eliara said, "You must go alone and speak with the spirit, and let it see who you are and what you carry inside." And John nodded and stepped forward, and the door opened with a breath of warm wind inside the chamber. Everything was dark and silent, and then a soft light rose from the ground and took shape like a tree made of stars, and a voice that was both male and female spoke gently, saying, "Why have you come to this place, bearer of warmth?" And John said, "I do not know. I only came to fix my ship, and now I am here, and they think I'm something I do not understand." The voice replied, "Your heart carries no lie, your hands carry no greed, you give and expect nothing, and in that truth the land accepts you." And then the light grew brighter, and the chamber began to hum with life, and John felt the ground beneath him pulse like a heartbeat, and he knew something deep had changed forever. Stepped out of the chamber and saw Eliara waiting, and her eyes filled with tears, and she said, "It spoke to you." And John nodded slowly, and the city bells began to ring, and the sky changed color, and from every window, the people began to sing the song of return and hope. John looked at the sky and whispered, "I think I am really not going home anytime soon. Asterisk, 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 asterisk." The night sky above the alien city shimmered with shifting colors like slow-moving fire across water, and John stood on the high balcony of the temple looking down at the glowing streets where people danced and sang and waved banners made of light. And he could still hear the echo of their voices calling him the seed bringer, the healer, the chosen one, and yet, inside his heart, a question burned like quiet fire, asking why me and what. Now Liara stood beside him, wearing a robe made of soft green silk that flowed like water, and her eyes reflected the sky as she spoke, gently saying, "The council is pleased, the chamber spoke to you, and the spirit accepted you, and that has never happened before, not for hundreds of years, and now the next step must begin." And John turned to her and asked what next step, and she said, "The test of life." In the early morning light, the temple bells rang with a low, deep sound, and the golden doors opened as the priests led John down long halls filled with murals of ancient times, showing a man from the sky touching the earth and flowers blooming around his feet and life returning to the dying trees. And now the people believed John was the one who could do this again. They brought him to a courtyard filled with quiet women sitting in circles around pools of clear water, and each one looked different, but all had the same sadness in their eyes. The sadness of waiting and hoping and losing and trying again and again without any child ever being born. And Eliara said, "These are the sacred ones who carry the future in their hearts, but their wombs remain silent and cold, and if you are the true bringer, your gift will awaken what has long slept." John felt nervous and stepped forward, and one of the women named Lyra stood and walked to him with slow steps and bowed her head and reached out her hands, and he held them gently and asked her if this was okay, and she nodded and led him to a shaded place near a tree with silver bark and sat beside him and closed her eyes and waited for his touch. He placed his hands on her back, just as he had with Eliara, and he moved them with care, feeling the tension in her muscles and the silent cries in her bones, and he whispered calm words even though she did not understand them, and soon her breathing slowed and her shoulders relaxed, and then the air began to change and warm light rose from her skin, like smoke made of sunshine. The tree above them shivered and small leaves opened for the first time in years, and a soft sound like singing wind passed through the courtyard, and the other women stood and watched with wide eyes as the pool water near them began to glow, and tiny lights floated upward like fireflies made of hope, and the priests fell to their knees and wept. Liara stepped forward and said, "It is real again. The breath of life has returned." And Lyra opened her eyes and looked at John with a single tear sliding down her cheek, and placed her hand over her belly and nodded slowly, as if something inside her had begun to stir. But before the joy could rise higher, a sharp horn sound echoed from the mountains, and the skies darkened slightly, and Eliara turned her head sharply and said, "They are here. The outsiders have come. They must have heard the prophecy is fulfilled, and now they want the bringer for themselves." From the northern gate, a group of riders appeared on beasts with wings and tails like snakes of fire, and at the front rode a tall woman with armor made of bone and metal, and her hair braided with sharp stones. And she looked down at the temple and raised her spear and shouted in a strong voice, "Bring the human to me now, or we will take him by force." The priests ran to block the temple gates, and the people gathered in fear, and Eliara stood tall and said to John, "That is the Warburn tribe. They do not believe in peace or in prophecy, and they think everything must be taken with power. And now they want you to prove your gift in front of their queen, or they will destroy what we have rebuilt." John took a deep breath and looked at the women around him, and at the glowing pools and the singing leaves, and he knew he could not walk away and let this be lost again, and he said, "Tell her I will go with her, but I will not be a prisoner." And Eliara nodded, and her voice rang across the courtyard, saying, "The bringer accepts the challenge of the queen, and he will come without chains and without fear." The Warburn queen smiled like a hunter and turned her beast and flew back toward the mountains, and the priests whispered prayers, and the women wept with both joy and worry. And Eliara took John's hand and said, "You are brave, and you are kind, and maybe that is what this world needs most." And he smiled and said, "I am just a man who gives massages." They both laughed, and the sky above began to lighten again, and far away in the distance, the mountain gates opened wide, and the next part of the path waited for the bringer of life to take his step into the heart of the storm. The night was silent, but it was not calm, and the stars above seemed to tremble with some secret fear. And deep inside the temple, John could not sleep, and his mind was filled with voices from earlier that day, the chants of the people, the warnings of Eliara, the cold eyes of the Warburn queen, and the strange warmth he felt during the healing of Lyra. And he stared at the ceiling where glowing vines moved like rivers of light, and wondered what would come next. Outside the temple walls, the city slept, but in the shadows near the outer garden something moved, something fast and careful and full of purpose, and it came without sound and touched the air like it belonged to the wind, and in a moment it was inside and slipping past guards and censors and spells, and it climbed the wall with claws made for stone and reached the balcony. Where John stood lost in thought, he heard no sound, but the wind shifted, and something in his chest warned him. And he turned just as a giant shadow leaped forward and wrapped around him, and his mouth opened to shout, but no words came as something pressed to his neck, and the world around him spun and tilted and became sky and cloud and stars as he was lifted high above the city by a beast with wings like leather and muscles like stone. He saw the temple shrinking below him, and the city lights turning into rivers of gold, and then darkness swallowed everything as the beast flew into a canyon between jagged mountains where no songs were sung and no bells were ever rung. And he was thrown to the ground in front of a circle of warriors with armor that shone like blood under moonlight, and at the center stood the queen. She stepped forward and looked down at him with eyes like knives and said in a voice sharp as broken glass, "So this is the one, the soft-handed healer, the sky-born bringer of seeds." And she laughed, and it sounded like thunder rolling through bone, and she circled him slowly and added, "You do not look like a god. You look like a lost farmer who took a wrong path through the stars." John stood up slowly and wiped the dust from his face and said, "I never said I was a god. I only helped someone in pain, and they believed it meant something, and I do not know why." And the queen raised an eyebrow and said, "You speak plainly, and that is rare, but plain words do not make miracles, and if you want me to believe, then you must pass the true test, not a temple test with singing and flowers, but a real one with pain and truth and fire." She snapped her fingers, and two warriors brought forward a woman covered in scars and silence. And the queen said, "This is my sister. She has not spoken in many years. Not since the war, not since the poison rains, not since the dream plague touched her, and she has never smiled, never wept, never moved beyond these walls. And if you can bring light into her, then I will believe that you are more than just a story." John looked at the woman and saw that her eyes were deep wells of darkness, and her skin was pale like snow under ash, and he walked to her slowly and knelt beside her and touched her hand, and it was cold, like stone left in a cave for 100 years, and he whispered, "I am not magic, I am not chosen, I am only someone who listens and someone who tries, and if you want to rest, I will help you." He placed his hands on her shoulders and closed his eyes and breathed slowly and let his fingers follow the lines of pain hidden in her body, and he pressed gently where the weight of silence lived, and he moved his palms where sorrow had made a home, and slowly her breath changed and her back straightened and her lips parted like she was trying to speak, but no sound came. The wind around them stopped, and the warriors grew silent, and even the queen tilted her head as the woman opened her eyes, and tears began to fall without sound, and her hand rose and touched John's face, and she whispered a single word that no one had heard from her in years, and the word was warm and soft and full of life. And the queen took a step back, and her face lost all its fire. The warriors fell to one knee without being told, and the queen looked at John like she was seeing him for the first time and said, "You are not a god, and yet you carry the breath of one." And she turned away and walked to the edge of the cliff and stood in silence for a long time before saying, "You are free to go or free to stay, and the mountain will not rise against you." John nodded and walked back to the woman who had spoken and helped her sit beneath a tree. And she smiled through her tears, and the queen watched them both and said quietly, "Maybe the old ways were wrong, maybe. Strength is not in fire but in fingers that heal without burning." Far away in the valley below, the bells of the temple rang again, and the wind carried their sound through the mountains, and the Warburn tribe listened without rage for the first time. And in the sky above, a line of stars formed a path that seemed to wait for footsteps that had not yet been taken. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The morning light spilled across the mountains like liquid fire, and the winds moved slow and soft, carrying the smell of ash and morning bloom. And John stood at the edge of the Warburn camp, watching the valley below where the city of lights waited. And for the first time in days, he felt something strange, not peace, not fear, but a quiet calling deep within his bones, like something hidden had begun to stir. Beside him stood the Warburn queen, her face cold as stone, and her voice low as thunder. Trapped in a cave, as she said, "You changed something last night, not just in my sister, but in all of us, and that makes you dangerous, not because you bring war, but because you end it, and some do not want the ending to come." John turned to her and asked, "What do you mean?" And she pointed toward the dark mountains beyond the skyline where no light ever touched, and said, "There are places, even we do not go, places where whispers live and watchers wait, and we have seen machines walking without breath and signals that do not belong to this world or yours." She told him about the silent zone, where animals do not go, and where the plants grow twisted and pale, and where the stars above seem to disappear. And she said, "We found an old ruin there, once made of metal and glass, and voices spoke from inside, without bodies, and told us to leave and never return. And we listened because we fear what we do not understand." John felt something sharp inside his memory, a piece of training from his space days about old research zones abandoned by human fleets long ago, and he remembered stories of forgotten stations left to run alone with programs still active and missions never canceled. And he thought maybe, just maybe, this had something to do with the infertility that cursed this planet. He asked the queen to take him there, and though she hesitated, her eyes showed curiosity, and she agreed. And they rode together on a beast with wings like sails and claws like steel, and flew above the black forest until they reached a place where everything went quiet, where even the wind forgot how to whisper, and the sun refused to shine. Ruin stood like a wound in the earth, made of twisted towers and broken wires and doors that opened without being touched. And John stepped inside while the queen waited with a spear ready. And as he moved through the narrow halls, lights flickered and old screens blinked to life, and a voice from nowhere said, "Welcome, user access confirmed, Project 0291 status active." And John froze. He walked deeper, and the air grew colder, and the walls were covered in human writing and logos from the United Earth Science Division, and he saw pictures of alien life forms and notes about fertility control and population models. And he found a control panel that showed the entire region covered in a silent signal designed to suppress reproductive function through biofrequency interference. He realized then that this was no curse, no punishment from the stars, but a human experiment that was never stopped, and the aliens were part of a test, and they never even knew. And his hands shook as he read more pages. Logs written by someone named Dr. Reyes, who had stayed behind to observe and adjust. And one final message played on a broken screen. The doctor appeared pale and thin with tired eyes, and a voice that cracked as he said, "If you are watching this, then I am probably dead or worse, and I am sorry. I did not mean for it to last this long. But I could not stop, and I could not leave. They needed to remain controlled. We failed before, and this time we had to try something different. And now, I see we were wrong, but I am too deep and too far gone." John stepped back and the floor creaked. And behind him a panel opened, and a figure stepped out wrapped in wires and metal, with skin faded and eyes full of madness, and it was not a recording this time, and the man said, "So you found it, and I see the project worked after all, and the God has arrived at last." It was Dr. Reyes, alive, but no longer fully human. Something in him had merged with the station and the signal, and he moved like a puppet, half controlled and half decaying, and he looked at John and smiled and said, "They cannot be allowed to grow again. You do not understand the danger. They are not just victims. They are weapons in waiting, and I will not let you break the balance." John raised his hands and said, "They are not weapons. They are people with hearts and hopes and love, and you took that away, and I am going to give it back." And Reyes screamed, and machines roared to life, and wires shot from the walls, and the whole ruin began to shake. John ran through the sparks and lights, dodging machines and falling debris. And he reached the core chamber and pulled the main power control, and with all his strength he shut it down, and the signal stopped, and the silence that followed was deeper than space. Outside, the black trees began to bloom, and the air warmed, and the queen felt it and raised her head and knew something had changed. And far away in the valley, every flower opened at once, and every river sang again, and the land itself whispered that the enemy was gone, and the path was open. John stepped out of the ruin covered in dust and light, and behind him the old world fell silent for the last time, and above him the stars blinked like they had been waiting. Smoke rose behind him in soft spirals as John walked away from the broken ruin, and each step felt heavier than the last, as if the truth itself had added weight to his soul. And he did not look back, because some things do not need to be seen twice, and the voice of Dr. Reyes still echoed in his ears, not as words, but as pain and fear and something else he could not yet name. Wind carried the scent of fresh bloom through the forest, now alive again, and every branch whispered with new color and sound, and John moved through it like a shadow between memories and futures. And when he reached the high ridge above the valley, he paused and looked down and saw the lights of the city glowing with new warmth, and he knew they felt the change. Tuliara stood waiting on the temple steps, her silver hair catching the sunlight, and her eyes filled with more questions than answers. And when John approached, she asked, "What did you find in the mountains, and why does the land sing with new breath?" And he told her everything without hiding, and her face turned from wonder to sorrow and then to a quiet kind of fire. She said they were used and broken and watched like animals in a lab, and yet they still found ways to sing and grow and love. And she took his hand and said, "Now we must face what remains, because truth is not the end of the path, it is only the gate." The council gathered that evening in the heart chamber, where the spirit tree shimmered with gentle light, and John stood before them and told the full story of Project 0291 and the machine network and Dr. Reyes, and how the planet had been trapped in a silent war. And when he finished, no one spoke for a long time, because the truth was heavier than stone. Then an elder rose, his eyes clouded with age, but his voice steady, and said, "We always believed our suffering was part of the natural way or punishment for a forgotten sin. But now we know we were never cursed. We were chained, and someone held the key far beyond the stars." John said, "I destroyed the signal, and the station is gone, and the machines are silent, but something tells me that Reyes was not alone, and something deeper is still watching." And he looked out the window at the dark horizon and felt the wind change again, not with fear this time, but with warning. That night he walked alone through the city streets, and the people offered him flowers and songs, and some bowed and called him Savior, but he only smiled and nodded and kept walking, because he still did not feel like a hero, only a man who had touched too many wounds with too little time. As he reached the outer edge of the city, where the lights faded and the fields began, he saw a figure standing beneath a tree, a tall figure with a long coat and a wide hat, and when John came closer, the figure turned and said, "You really made a mess of things back there," and his voice was dry like sand over steel. Man removed his hat and revealed a human face, aged and lined, but not unfamiliar, and John stepped back and said, "Who are you?" And the man said, "Name is Kellen, Earth Command Special Observer, retired now, I suppose, since you blew up my base and released classified signals into open air." And John asked, "Are you with Reyes?" And Kellen laughed without joy and said, "No one is with Reyes anymore. Not even Ray Skellen said Reyes was a genius once, but he lost himself in control in numbers, and he stopped seeing people and started seeing problems to fix, and when Command abandoned the experiment, Reyes stayed because he believed only he could finish it, and you found what he became, and now here we are." John narrowed his eyes and said, "Are you here to stop me?" And Kellen shook his head and said, "No, I am here to warn you, because now that the signal is down, others will notice, others who watched from far away and said nothing as long as things stayed quiet, and now they will want answers or worse, control. Asterisk, 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 asterisk." He handed John a small device, a disc no larger than a coin, and said, "This will let you speak to me if you need, but be careful with your next steps, because what you started cannot be undone, and some people do not like waking up to a world they no longer control." Then Kellen walked into the night and disappeared like fog into shadow, and John stood alone, with the disc in his palm and questions in his chest, and he looked at the stars and wondered who else might be looking back in the temple. Eliara waited with a map in her hands, not a map of roads or cities, but of energy lines across the planet, places where the ground still felt sick, and she said, "If Reyes was only one piece, then we must find the others and cleanse what remains." And John took the map and nodded and said, "Then we keep going." The spirit tree pulsed behind them, and far beyond the mountains a new signal stirred, one that did not come from this world, and in a silent chamber hidden under silver soil something old began to blink again, something that had been waiting not for centuries, but for this very moment when one human chose to heal instead of rule. Asterisk, the skies above the valley no longer whispered fear, but instead hummed with something new, something gentle and rising like breath after a long sleep, and the air carried the scent of green things growing where nothing had bloomed before, and deep inside the temple of the spirit tree, John stood with Eliara by his side, and in his hands he held the map of lifelines etched in glowing ink that pulsed with the memory of a world healing itself one breath at a time. Had visited the western sands where fire once reigned, and now wild grass danced in the wind, and the eastern marsh where the water had tasted like rust, but now frogs sang beneath the lily, and each place they touched gave back a little of what had been taken, and each step carved a path not of conquest, but of care, and the people who watched began to believe not in a god, but in a man who chose to listen. The children followed him through fields and forests, not with chants or chains, but with questions and laughter and hands full of flowers, and everywhere he went, someone would say, "My sister can speak again," or "The birds have returned," or "My belly grows warm where it was once cold," and he would smile and say softly, "It was never me. It was always you waking up," but in the deep places where sun never touched, a quiet rumble grew, and far beneath the roots of forgotten towers machines blinked in patterns only other machines understood, and signals once blocked now flowed freely, and a new presence stirred in circuits older than memory, one that watched and waited and calculated with patience that only metal could hold. In the heart of the mountains, Kellen returned to his quiet outpost and looked across the void with scanners tuned to wavelengths unknown to this world, and he frowned as the readings changed and the blinking lights told him that something had noticed the silence that followed the fall of Reyes, and he whispered to no one in particular, "They are coming now, and nothing will stop them from asking why." In the sky above, a strange light appeared for just a moment, like a crack between dimensions and was gone before any eye could focus, but the wind changed, and the animals ran, and even the rivers held their breath for a moment, as if the planet itself remembered what it meant to be prey. John stood in the valley once more, beside a great stone where people had carved words of hope and names of children not yet born, and he touched the stone and closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of the ground, and said to Eliara, "I think they are coming." And she said, "Who?" And he replied, "The ones who built the chains before the ones who forgot us, and now remember." Eliara looked toward the horizon where the clouds moved like armies, and her voice did not shake as she said, "Then let them come, because this time we are not silent, and this time we are not broken. And if they come with machines, we will meet them with roots, and if they come with fear, we will meet them with songs, and if they come with fire, then they will learn that life burns brighter than metal." The people gathered in circles that night, not for war, but for stories, and each elder spoke of how the land had changed, and each child listened like the stars were sitting beside them. And when John stood to speak, he did not raise his hands or his voice. He only said, "I did not mean to find this place or this people, but I found something here that matters, and I will stand with you for as long as I breathe." Far above them, hidden among stars, a silent vessel watched. An inside machine spoke in symbols and decided that contact would begin, and below the spirit tree pulsed again, this time faster, as if the planet itself felt the approach of eyes long forgotten, and John felt it too deep in his bones, like a storm not of rain but of memory. Days passed, and then a shadow appeared in the sky, not large but wide like a falling dream, and it landed not with thunder but with silence, and when it opened, a figure stepped out. Not machine, not alien, but something in between, and it spoke in perfect tones, saying, "We come seeking answers." And John stepped forward with Eliara beside him, and said, "Then ask, and we will answer." Figure looked around at the trees and the people in the light, and said, "How did this place heal?" And John answered, "Because we chose to listen instead of command, and we chose to feel instead of fix, and we chose to give instead of take." And the figure paused as if such words did not compute. Then a child ran forward and offered the figure a flower and said, "Welcome to our world." And the figure took the flower and looked at it for a long time, and then looked back at John and said, "Perhaps we have forgotten what you remember, and that is dangerous and beautiful and rare." John smiled and said, "Maybe it is time you learned again." And in that moment, the ground did not shake, the sky did not roar, but something bigger happened. The seed of change took root in a place no machine could measure, and it began to grow in silence and in song. Asterisk, 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 asterisk.